Welcome back. KXEL Live and Local continues. I'm joined on the news line by Professor Danielle Zanzalari. She is an economics professor at Seton Hall University and has some thoughts about this debt ceiling debate. First of all, thanks so much for taking the time. Welcome to KXEL.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
You wrote a piece, an op-ed piece. I want to talk about the piece and your viewpoint, but first, just so we're all using the same terms, explain for those who may not be conversant, what is the debt ceiling? What impact does it have if Congress acts or doesn't act on the current issue?
So the debt ceiling is the maximum amount that the U.S. government is allowed to borrow. As it currently stands, it's $31.4 trillion, and we actually hit the debt ceiling in January 2023. And so what this says is that we cannot actually fund some of our current obligations in the United States government. Some of those obligations are, payments to Social Security recipients, welfare recipients, whether it's funding for transportation costs, pensions, programs that we always pay for monthly or even annually or quarterly. We can't actually make those payments. So while we hit this debt ceiling in January, the government can do some fancy accounting tricks to kind of make this be okay until the summer. But by the time we hit this summer, we are going to reach our statutory debt limit. And for, listeners here, this is kind of akin to your credit card company where you're given a max credit limit that you can spend. So if your max credit limit's $5,000, you can't spend more than $5,000 and you'll get denied. It's very similar to the U.S. Congress. But for your credit card company, you'd have to call them and say, please, can I have another $1,000 or $2,000 extension? Congress is doing the exact same thing. They have to agree to the Treasury is asking Congress, please raise this debt ceiling, and legislators have to agree and pass a bill to raise this ceiling to spend more.
And that's all well and good if you are taking care of how you spend the money and budgeting in a responsible manner, like we would assume someone in their home budget would do. But Congress just has never had a problem with raising their own debt limit. That's the thing that is interesting. They just have the authority to raise that debt limit and then spend as much as they can possibly spend, correct?
That's correct. They've actually raised the limit 78 times since 1960. So if you're kind of thinking of the math in your head, that's more than once per year. Well, this doesn't always come up once per year because Congress could, make this debt limit very high, $50 trillion, and delay discussing this again in the future. They tend to raise this. So, the point of my piece is if you're going to keep raising this limit, then why do we even have it in the first place? This is the only thing stopping Congress from spending too much money. So some people really do like that, but it really hasn't, we've never not raised it. So kind of what's the point? And, for regular consumers, if we spend too much money, as you suggested, Jeff, we would absolutely cut back our budget, try to figure out, let's not go out to eat this week. Let's not buy this T-shirt. Let's, cut back. Congress is never looking at how to cut back. In fact, in December, they passed another spending bill to spend more money. The problem is, while that passed, they don't actually have the money, like the credit limit, to do that. And so that lies the problem.
That's sort of like calling MasterCard or Discover or Visa in a personal situation and saying, well, I've already agreed to buy this new car, so you have to increase my credit limit by $20,000 or whatever so that I can buy the car. And that's really the same thing here in terms of a level of irresponsibility, spending when there is no way that you have the funds and you haven't been assured of the extension of credit.
I completely agree. I love that analogy, Jeff.
So the idea of not doing this every year or a couple of times a year or whatever, to your point, all right, $50 trillion there. Well, isn't the danger, and I think it's been proven, if they raised it to $50 trillion, they'll just spend to $50 trillion. This exercise at least slows it down a bit, archaic though it may be.
Yes, it does slow it down a bit, but you can see Congress now, it just feels a little bit like political chaos or political theater, however you want to look at this, where they're trying to, the Republicans at the current moment are trying to get some concessions, say let's cut some spending, we'll raise it, we want to cut spending. And the Democrats don't want to cut any spending programs. But at the pace what we're doing, we're adding about $1 trillion in debt per year. And that's expensive. With debt, so the government, the U.S. Treasury issues bonds, and they take the money that they, earn and that they get from bonds this year and pay off old debt, and they continue to do this. And there's not a problem. We've been doing this for decades in the United States. There's only a problem if people don't want to lend to anymore. So if you have too much debt, investors are, going to find somewhere else to put their money. So far, the U.S., while we have a lot of debt, $31.4 trillion to be exact, it's risky to just say, hey, there's no limit, we can go anywhere. But at the same time, it's also interesting because some of these Congress people voted yes on the spending bill in December, and now they're complaining, well, I don't want to raise the limit because we're spending too much.
Well, I guess as long as the voters let them get away with it, they can do that. Seton Hall economics professor Danielle Zanzalari is joining us on News Talk 1540 KXEL. She wrote an op-ed in the Detroit News recently on this topic of the debt ceiling. Best situation, I presume, for you as an economist looking at it, never mind the politics, is to live within your means, correct? And that's something that I guess we can only wish would happen, since it's really in the political interest of both parties to pass a lot of pork that they can then share with voters back home.
Yes, I agree. So for, politicians are trying to maximize one thing, to get reelected,
Yes.
stay in power. They could claim to be benevolent, and maybe some are. But ultimately, how do they get reelected? They do things that people want to do. And a lot of those times it's spending more money, pumping money in the economy, making sure the economy is doing well. But sometimes when that happens, we get inflation, which is what we're seeing today. And there's ramifications to doing always what people want to do and what might not be economically responsible. Inflation has real costs on people. Goods are really a lot more expensive. They were over 8% higher last year. Most people's wages didn't go up 8%. I know mine did it. So, while the problem is, as, prices and all these things go up in society, so does borrowing money. And so every time the government spends more money and can, increase inflation, it leads to future higher borrowing costs. And this is going to be kind of a snowball problem. So part of my point in this article was, we really need to have a serious conversation about cutting spending too. We shouldn't be kind of every year, every 2 years going on this debt ceiling and then making no real changes.
That's one of the real issues, because you could just, as you note, if you're not going to control spending, then just do away with this whole charade. Is there a fear that if there is no debt ceiling, so that we don't have to go through this exercise of fits and starts, will spending become even more out of control potentially without even this very narrow, thin tissue of a check on it?
I think it depends on the mix of people in Congress. I think, both sides that are currently in power, both political parties, have different goals. One of the biggest things about this current debt ceiling, and one of the reasons that I actually am in favor of abolishing it, is because all of this chaos about raising it, the fights every week with the Republicans and Democrats and President Biden, they're fighting over whether they should raise this. This actually is causing investors to panic. If we actually do not raise the debt ceiling, we are defaulting on our debt. What that means is we are literally saying, come this summer, we are not paying the things we promised to pay. So those over 65 collecting their pension, via Social Security, you're not getting that. Even though we promised you for years and years, you're not getting that. People that lent us money, in the 80s or 90s, and they have bonds out, and they're supposed to be due their payment for lending us money for 30 years. Well, they're not going to get that. And what that does is that actually creates investors being very scared to lend to the United States in the future. If you know you're not going to possibly get your money back, do you really want to invest in them? And that's one of the reasons why I think the city of Detroit really liked this piece, because Detroit defaulted on their debt from a municipality in 2013. Mm-hmm. And so they couldn't pay their debt. And what ends up happening is most local cities and state governments need to issue bonds to borrow money to pay workers, make nice roads, build schools. So you have to issue debt to pay for things in the present. Well, if you default on your debt, people don't trust you as much. So the city of Detroit had to increase how much they're paying the people if they borrow their money. So if you, in 2016, for example, decided to lend the city of Detroit money, you felt comfortable enough to do that for the city of Detroit, they paid an interest rate of 2.34% higher than most municipal bonds. You're looking at a difference of like an interest rate of about $18 million more a year just in one city because you were proven not to be trustworthy a few years before. For the size of the United States government, in the trillions of dollars of debt that we're in, that would be a very substantial increase in our interest payments.
And every time the Fed increases rates, whether we stopped an increase of spending or not, we're paying more on the existing debt. So there's this multiplicity of factors, and none of it turns out well. I am intrigued by the hesitancy people have now, the nervousness, as you mentioned. We've always increased the debt ceiling. They always walk right up to the deadline and then just barely get some agreement. But yet, this time does feel different to where people are saying, okay, there's just enough crazy going on all fronts in this economy. Maybe we are much more cautious as opposed to confident that they will come to some deal. Is that a fair assessment?
I think they're going to come to a deal because defaulting on our debt, we've never done. Do you want to be the Congress that does it for the very first time? You have to put away your political differences, whether or not you think you should cut spending or not. I think the Republicans will ultimately raise the debt ceiling because it's too important. It's going to cost our country trillions of dollars extra in the future if we default on our debt. You don't want to be one of the countries around the world to default on our debt. The U.S. is seen as the most the safest place to invest in from a federal government standpoint of most countries around the world. That's why we get a influx of foreign dollars here, which is great. It does help us fund our government, and we promise to pay them back in the future, and that's not a problem. But we need the money, and no one's willing to give it to us in the future. That does become a problem. And countries that are safer, more reliable, stable government, people want to put their dollars in. They don't want to risk putting their dollars in and not getting it, not get it back. So defaulting on our debt is too precious, and I do not think they're going to do it. So my whole point is this tends to be a political charade every time we do it. Why raise it 78 times since 1960? Just abolish it.
That's very interesting insight. I really appreciate the conversation because, again, we have heard people sound the alarm about what happens if there is a default and why it's a doomsday scenario, but no one that I've read has actually said, let's just get rid of the charade altogether. And so I really appreciate that fresh insight, and thanks for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me.
Economics professor Danielle Zanzalari. Her piece in the Detroit News advocates just getting rid of the federal debt ceiling altogether because it has become nothing more than a bit of a political charade. And she joined us on the Newsline, a conversation we recorded yesterday afternoon, so you could hear it now.